July 1945, a warm, windless afternoon settles over the lake country outside Berlin. The roads are busy with staff cars and motorcycles, the air tinged with wet stone and cigarette smoke. Inside the brick courtyards of Cecilienhof, the victors of a long European war prepare to sit face to face. The moment carries a certain ceremony. Polished boots on flagstones, folders stacked by orderlies, ashtrays set at exact angles. Germany lies defeated and divided, in fact, if not yet, in writing. The meetings that follow may decide how that division is managed, how borders are drawn, and how authority will be exercised over millions. This program presents a speculative reconstruction grounded in public records and historical references. It draws on visible details and cautious inferences using materials such as conference minutes and official communiques where available. The focus remains on tone, sequence, and plausible behavior in the immediate post-war setting. Nothing here claims privileged access, and assertions are hedged when the record is thin or ambiguous. The atmosphere is reserved, practical, and tense in quiet ways. Attendees will choose words carefully, avoid direct promises, and keep options open. Each step may look choreographed, but intentions remain layered. The setting is grand, yet the mood seems provisional. What follows traces the pace of these days, using credible detail, neutral language, and a steady path through the halls and terraces where plans are advanced in careful increments. The day begins with small signals that matter only because everything else is uncertain. Chauffeurs, open doors, and aides hover with notepads pressed flat against their sleeves. A fine dust rises from the courtyard and settles across the door brass, dulled by many hands. The first handshakes are deliberate and short, eyes steady, faces composed, gestures conservative, in a place where overstatement might be read as threat. Chairs have been arranged along a long table with green baize, picketed by water carafes and slim glasses. A shallow silver bell stands near the center for procedural calls, inconspicuous yet ready. The map cases rest against the wall, their leather worn by hard travel. These people have met before in different rooms and under harsher clocks, but this setting differs. Victory is real, and so is the problem of managing it. A window stands open to a clipped garden where gravel paths draw geometric lines under the linden shade. Morning light glances off a stack of thin paper, the first draft agenda. The items are plain: administration, borders, reparations, and the machinery of occupation. No rhetoric appears on the page. This supports a public tone of method and restraint. Yet the silences between items do much of the talking. Aides circulate typed copies of the day's schedule, stamped in the corner with a time and room number from the Secretariat. A neutral hand records who speaks and for how long, a habit that will later supply many sentences to the conference minutes. The first speaker refers to prior agreements and insists on continuity, signaling that new decisions should not unspool old threads. Another emphasizes security on the ground and the need for uniform instructions to commanders in the field. A third voice, careful but firm, points to the economic base of recovery and the danger of chaos if rules are improvised. No one raises their voice. Translations are crisp and unhurried, timed to the rhythm of practiced interpreters who measure each phrase against two audiences, those in the room and those elsewhere, who will eventually read the communiques. The formal official picture is one of steady cooperation. At a glance, it appears complete enough, but not everything fits that frame. A pause after a mention of Poland lasts a shade too long. A note is passed and set under a blotter. A delegate asks for a point to be clarified, though the word seems to cover a disagreement rather than a misunderstanding. The mood stays even, but the table breathes in slow, guarded cycles. A lunch break punctures the morning with a soft change of texture: white porcelain, buttered bread, a clear broth, and a modest main. Simple fare after years of rationing. Publicly, food is not a subject. Privately, its modesty makes sense in a city that has barely resumed normal supply. After lunch, the talk returns to structure. They speak about zones of occupation as if drawing a seating chart for a house already divided by internal doors. Military governors will manage their districts, report upward, and coordinate at agreed points, but the authority of each power remains intact. This design promises both coherence and autonomy, which pleases the public statement but leaves room for future friction. It is an arrangement that looks solid on paper and mobile in practice. A messenger brings the first draft of a press line, clipped to a folder. 2 sentences propose a tone of unity and necessary firmness. A third sentence is bracketed for review. Words are weighed, adjusted, and reseated on the page. The communiques will later prove valuable because they show how each party wanted the day to be understood. They will not, by themselves, explain how decisions were reached. Afternoon light shifts across the table, cooling from yellow to gray. The first day closes without crisis and without closure, which may be the most realistic outcome for a meeting built from different aims. Aides gather papers, and the bell stays untouched. The official record is careful with few adjectives. The private memory of the day might emphasize the texture of pauses and a steady use of polite ambiguity as a tool. As the room clears, a small group remains behind to review the order of topics for tomorrow. And the map cases are drawn closer to the table for what appears to be a more precise session on administrative lines and transport corridors, setting the stage for the next hour when maps will be unrolled and traced with measured fingertips. The table looks broader once the maps are opened. It is a practical illusion produced by scale and paper. Heavy sheets are drawn from the leather tubes and aligned under glass rulers. Germany appears in bands of pale ink, its cities marked with small circles and a set of narrow lines that carry rail traffic across ruined bridges and patched embankments. Town names sit in tidy type, even where buildings have no roofs. The room quiets in the way a room often does when paper means more than speech. No one needs to declare that this is the core of the day. The presence of these sheets does it for them. Pencils are sharpened. Aides stand close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid crowding the map edge. The matter is simple to describe and complex to settle. Territorial lines must meet administrative lines in a way that can be enforced by people with limited fuel, short rations, and a long list of urgent tasks. The first finger traces the demarcations agreed months earlier and affirms them aloud, a point of stability. Then the pencil moves to rail junctions that sit close to boundaries and to ports that connect inland stockpiles with river routes. A second pencil indicates coal regions and power stations that supply distant districts. It is accepted that without steady coal, the cities and the factories will go dark. These remarks are neither dramatic nor new. They matter because they knit the map to the timetable of the occupation. The conversation is measured. No one raises claims as absolutes. Instead, speakers choose verbs like should, might, and could, which give room to adjust without appearing to retreat. An interpreter renders each phrase into another language with careful tenses, preserving caution. From time to time, someone points to a city whose administrative management may need a special arrangement, an exception to keep services from crossing a line that would complicate command. These are technical issues at first glance, but they carry hints of broader concerns about influence and access. A short break introduces typed extracts from a previous session's summary, the nearest thing this meeting has to a formal memory. The extracts confirm only the least disputed points, which serves a purpose. Nothing new is promised by accident. When a port is named, a second speaker asks about customs and police functions, not to stall, but to keep the tools of authority aligned. The map shows rivers that look gentle on paper, but in July carry debris and draw mosquitoes to their banks. Inland barges move slowly for lack of fuel. Roads are busy with military trucks and small convoys of relief supplies. All of this forms the context behind the polite words. Lines drawn in this room must work in the field. People who will never see Cecilienhof will have to follow these instructions with little room for improvisation. The pencils return to the coal regions and pause there. The subject is uncomfortable because it links to reparations and industrial dismantling, which falls beyond the present hour but presses against it. A note is made to keep the coal flow steady while other questions are sorted later. This is not a fix, but it keeps the table moving forward. A chair scrapes. The room temperature drops. The garden beyond the window shifts to a paler green. No one comments on the weather, because in this setting, weather is only a way to measure time. The official note-taker records adjectives sparingly. Verbs carry the day. The closest thing to a disagreement arrives when a supply corridor meets a proposed boundary. Neither side insists, and the pencils draw a modest adjustment that accommodates a rail spur and a yard with repair capacity. It looks minor, it is not. It is the kind of choice that shapes how a region recovers or stalls. The working atmosphere continues to be described in official language as cordial. That is not wrong. It is just not the whole. There is a second layer that shows itself in the care taken to avoid commitments that could be read as precedents. The hour ends with a plan to consolidate notes and circulate a draft showing the agreed lines and the unresolved items. The communiques will say that progress has been made on administrative arrangements and transport coordination. The minutes will show times and names and a list of maps used. None of it says what a casual observer would still feel while watching the pencils. A quiet impression that standard procedures are being stretched to cover problems that are not standard. The last act of the session is simple. The maps slide into their cases with a soft sigh of paper, and the green baize returns to its flat, ordinary surface. The next subject has been visible all afternoon, peering in from the edge of the agenda where it has waited for its turn. And the room prepares to take up reparations and economic controls with the same careful voices, the same steady pens, and a new set of numbers that no one wants to recite aloud in a city that still smells of smoke. The subject of reparations enters without fanfare and immediately tightens the air. It is not a single question, but a net of questions, all knotted to need, to loss, and to the practical limits of administration. The door is partly closed to reduce corridor noise. Tables in the side room carry thin stacks of typed figures, not arranged as a ledger, but as notes toward a ledger that cannot be finished here. Coffee arrives in small cups that cool quickly. The opening lines assert what everyone already accepts. Germany will pay in goods and capacity, rather than currency that no longer holds clear meaning. That frame leaves much undecided. The first speaker mentions plant lists and machine tools that might be dismantled. A second stresses the need to keep basic production going to avoid famine and unrest. The terms do not clash directly, yet they pull in different directions. A staff officer points to the relationship between rail stock, coal output, and food distribution. If too much is stripped, supply falters. If too little is collected, obligations remain unmet. The official picture, when presented later, will say that principles were affirmed. That statement may be accurate and still incomplete. Numbers on the page are not arguments, but they give arguments places to stand. A figure for coal output is followed by a figure for transport losses and a cautious projection for the winter load. None of it looks generous. Interpreters keep pace, trimming idioms, preserving qualifiers, and returning the phrases in balanced tones. An aide moves quietly, exchanging one set of sheets for another that summarize the allocation concept. Each occupying power draws from its zone with certain exchanges to balance shortfalls. This keeps the design simple on paper and complex in practice. Side remarks indicate that enforcement will rest with local authorities who are already stretched thin. A single missing rail car becomes a chain of delays across 3 districts. The discussion returns to shipyards, foundries, and electrical equipment. Some items are marked for removal, some for shared use in place, some for review after inspections. The words temporary and provisional appear often. No one pretends that temporary measures do not harden into habit over time, but no one wishes to say it aloud either. A brief reference is made to a prior public statement about treating Germany as an economic unit despite zonal administration. The phrase gathers nods because it sounds sensible and looks good in a communique. Yet the weight of zonal authority presses back. This is where the record shows a steady technical tone, while the lived moment feels denser. A pencil taps near the margin of a note marked allocations. Another pencil circles food imports and writes priority. The side room grows warmer. Windows open a little. A typewriter starts up in an adjoining office, striking a rhythm that lifts and falls with the keys. The meeting hears, with restrained reactions, a short report on war damage that touches on losses outside Germany's borders. It is not read for emotion. It is used to support claims for goods and equipment. No one interrupts. These facts are known and cannot be unknown. The question is narrow. How much is to be taken, from where, and when? The answer is a schedule with many blanks. The blanks will be filled later by people who never entered this room. A draft paragraph proposes that removals should avoid impairing the minimum level of civilian life. Another proposes that certain industries be restricted or redirected. The language is softened by verbs that remain open to later redefinition. This is the grammar of a fragile consensus. It moves and holds at once. The official minutes, when compiled, will record the headings, the time slots, and the existence of these paragraphs without telling the careful reader about the feel of the room, the low voices, the recurrent return to coal and bread, and the shared, tacit understanding that the numbers are not as flexible on the ground as they look on the page. As evening draws near, the group sketches a path. Inspection teams will inventory listed plants, a small board will adjudicate conflicts, and new figures will be circulated before the week ends. The plan sounds tidy because the clock demands tidiness. Outside, the gravel paths reflect a weak light. Inside, the papers are stacked and clipped with a steel spring, the top sheet bearing a neutral title and a date. The door opens, the corridor fills again with faint steps, and the next hour is signaled by a shift back to the larger room, where administrative control and public messaging will be aligned so that tomorrow's agenda can proceed without breaking the surface calm that has been maintained so far. The larger room receives them again, and with it a rhythm of procedure that values sequence over display, because the topic now is joint authority and the rules that will bind it. The chairs are the same, the green baize is the same, but the papers have changed. A new stack bears headings on administration, legal continuity, and the scope of powers for the military governments that already operate in their zones. The proposal on the table is plain in construction and hard in practice. An Allied Control Council will sit in Berlin and issue coordinated directives so that Germany is governed as a single economic unit while political authority remains divided by occupation. The phrasing is careful. It suggests shared purpose and keeps each hand free. An aide reads a summary of existing orders to civil officials, chosen to show what is already common across zones: registration of displaced persons, maintenance of basic services, and removal of those linked to the prior regime from positions of control. No one objects to the outline. The friction lies in the details, and the room knows it. A short extract from a meeting agenda earlier in the week is produced to anchor the language, and the words uniform, coordinated, and temporary appear, each promising stability while withholding finality. A delegate speaks about courts and the need to keep ordinary cases moving so that theft, fraud, and disputes over tenancy do not clog the streets with unresolved grievances. Another adds that certain categories must be handled by special tribunals to avoid confusion and delay. The tone is administrative and unromantic. Translators carry the cadence without showing strain. The discussion turns to denazification, which is treated as process rather than slogan identification, removal and review, with distinctions between those who led, those who followed, and those who were compelled. The emphasis is on criteria and the pace at which replacements can be trained or reassigned, because offices cannot sit empty without consequence. A cautious sentence proposes that professional competence should not be discarded when not linked to policy crimes. And a companion sentence adds that any exceptions must be recorded in writing and reviewed later. The suggestion wins no applause. It simply lowers the risk that road maintenance, water treatment, and hospitals will fail for lack of staff. A neutral mention is made of education and broadcasting, not to design curricula or programs, but to state that directives will prevent the return of propaganda and will allow local administrations to issue notices on food, shelter, and health. The room accepts the balance between control and routine because the alternative, voids, has no advocates. The council structure is drawn in simple lines, 4 commanders-in-chief acting jointly on major measures, their deputies working through directorates on finance, transport, communications, justice, and food. A liaison mechanism is sketched to manage contacts with relief agencies and to keep records aligned with what the public must be told. The record of this hour, when later reduced to minutes, will list headings and the existence of a planned directive on the arrest of leading offenders and the safeguarding of archives. The archives line seems ordinary until one remembers how much of administrative life depends on files that survived the spring and early summer in varying states of order. The paper trail is the memory of the state, and without it, 1,000 small decisions must be reinvented daily. Berlin, as a seat of joint authority, is reconfirmed, and with it the need for secure offices, reliable telephone circuits, and a courier schedule that can move signed orders across a city still navigating rubble. None of these needs are dramatic, but they determine whether a directive exists as more than a press sentence. Voices remain low. No one treats this as a stage. The language remains speculative at the edges, using verbs that admit adjustment, may be issued, are to be coordinated, shall be reviewed. A short intervention reminds the room that the police forces and city guards must be firmly supervised without being stripped to the bone, since theft of coal, food, and tools will run high in the months ahead. This prompts a return to the circular problem that shadows every topic: scarce resources, long queues, and winter approaching. The proposed solution is administrative rhythm rather than miracle. Weekly directives on supply priorities, monthly audits, and a public notice schedule to match, so that the street hears the same instructions the offices attempt to carry out. The neutral face of the plan is a strength and a limit at once. Behind the neutrality is a small anxiety that discipline may mean different things in different zones when pressures rise. The text anticipates this with a clause empowering the Control Council to settle disputes by recorded vote, which sounds decisive, but depends on cooperation that cannot be legislated inside a paragraph. Still, the paragraph remains. It is better to have one than not. The hour closes with a tidy request from the Secretariat that the delegates initial a draft protocol page marking the establishment of the Council and the principle of Germany as a single economic unit. Subject to coordinated occupation policies. Heads incline, pens move. The practical bridge to the next subject lies just beyond the page, where borders touch livelihoods and population movements touch floor space, and the room prepares to adjust from internal machinery to the outer lines where administration and territory meet. The subject enters with the gravity of geography. A frontier cannot be spoken of without summoning fields, railheads, and towns whose names carry memory. The table receives the issue without ceremony because ceremony cannot soften it. The eastern line is described with reference to rivers and a temporary administrative reach that will require later confirmation in a broader settlement. The phrasing avoids the tone of final treaty and holds to the language of present necessity. The river names are given in measured voices. An aide lays down a sheet mapping the projected control areas and the points at which customs, police, and postal functions may need relocation. The numbers of people involved in movements westward are not recited in a single figure. They appear instead as flows noted by local reports, which suggest tracts of countryside now emptied, urban quarters crowded, and stations that struggle to process families with luggage they can carry, and papers that still need stamping. The record favors the phrase that these transfers should be orderly and humane, which is both instruction and aspiration. It indicates a plan to coordinate rail timetables, food allotments en route, and receiving points in the occupation zones so that the administrative stress is distributed rather than concentrated. No one argues against the words. The difficulty lies in execution, which depends on rail cars that are already needed elsewhere, fuel that is thin, and town halls that can only register so many arrivals in a day. A delegate emphasizes that a managed process is the only available hedge against disorder, and adds that the language must be clear enough for field offices to act without multiple interpretations. The press sentence will be short. The appendices will carry the weight. An interpreter reads back a clause affirming that the final settlement of borders will await a broader conference, which preserves room for later diplomacy and prevents this room from presenting its decisions as permanent. The utility of this caution is evident to all. A second clause notes that the present administration, east of the line, works under a defined authority, and that cooperation on transport and food must continue across the line in the meantime. This is a practical necessity rather than a sign of agreement. It allows bread to move while maps are still provisional. The conversation stays in the register of logistics. Weak bridges and congested roads are mentioned without dramatics. Station masters are given a symbolic role in the discussion through the mention of standard forms and stamps that need to be recognized by receiving offices to prevent delays for families already in motion. The room does not recite hardships. It assigns lines of responsibility. A short, sober mention is made of property records, since the loss of papers can turn a household into a legal void. The agreed instruction is to keep duplicate sets of registrations in district offices, a routine choice that could help later when claims are reviewed. The first draft of the communique language is placed at the map's edge and shaped to be understood by a city listening for signs of stability and by distant readers who will scan for hints of permanency. It says as little as it must. It says enough to show direction. The official minutes later will reflect the neutral tone. They will not convey the way the room held still when the interpreter read the words orderly and humane, or how pencils paused over that line because it both states a hope and implies risk. The link between frontiers and supply returns as it must to coal and food figures. If too many trains are assigned to transfers, deliveries to mills and power stations falter. If too few, towns overflow and public health strains. The compromise is to layer schedules, set transfer trains at off-peak hours, post notices at stations a day in advance, and assign field officers to inspect sidings and switch yards weekly. These are not heroic measures. They are the difference between a system and a crush. The talk ends with a quiet recognition that the boundary remains formally unsettled and that the handling of people across it requires supervision right now. The draft statement carries this logic. Present administration will be respected pending a final peace, and movements of persons will follow procedures laid down by the occupying authorities in coordination with the offices operating east of the line. The chair gives a nod to the Secretariat to circulate the page for marginal notes overnight. No one expects the morning to change the river's course. What they expect is that tomorrow's lines on train tables and distribution lists will match the words they choose today. And with that expectation, the room turns back toward Berlin, where joint machinery must show itself in public for the first time in a way that looks calm, measured, and ready. Berlin draws them in like a center of gravity because the joint machinery must face daylight. The Allied Control Council will meet there, and with it the apparatus of directorates that translate principles into instructions. The city itself remains broken in many districts, but corridors of movement exist, and offices have been cleared and fitted with desks that match no single standard. The first matter is procedural, the Council's competence, meeting schedule, and the form of its directives. A plain format is agreed upon to avoid confusion: a header with date and number, a short title, operative paragraphs in numbered sequence, and a distribution list for the zones and the local offices that need to act. The second matter is tone. Orders must be clear without sounding punitive where routine is intended, and firm without inviting improvisation when prohibition is required. The text is composed with an eye on the public communique that will follow the conference's close. This is where language serves two masters. It must reassure a weary city that governance will be steady, and it must signal to distant capitals that the victors remain aligned. The draft communique reads easily. The leaders met, reviewed matters of common concern, reached understandings on administration, reparations, and the machinery of control, and expressed the intention to secure peace and recovery. The simple surface conceals the careful work behind it. A line affirms that Germany will be treated as a single economic unit under coordinated policies. Another states that measures are underway to remove instruments of war and take steps against those who directed the prior regime. Yet another refers to the Eastern administration and population transfers to be conducted in an orderly and humane manner. The room trims adjectives, spares adverbs, and protects verbs that carry weight. The signature page sits waiting with ample space. Before pens are lifted, an aide reads out a brief set of talking points, the sort of phrases that will be used in press encounters. Practical cooperation, necessary firmness, respect for obligations, and a steady focus on feeding cities and restoring services. The points are modest and deliberate. They avoid triumphant tones. They allow each delegation to match their home audience while preserving a common spine. The official record will list the communiqué as adopted. A collection of minutes will attach to it like scaffolding. One more matter is raised with brevity. Foreign ministers will meet in due course to continue discussions on a wider peace and on settlements that lie outside the scope of authority here. The insertion gives structure to what would otherwise be a gap. It prevents the impression that this room claims to finish what it can only begin. The administrative face of Berlin then receives attention in concrete terms. Office space is allocated. A small motor pool is assigned to the council secretariat. Timetables for couriers and telephone schedules are synchronized so that a directive signed in the morning can be known in all districts by the afternoon. This looks dull and is decisive. If messages sprawl, intentions tangle. An interpreter reads back the section on arrests and the safeguarding of records. The wording is precise because errors here ripple across institutions. The council will not chase theater. It will count files and issue numbered orders. The moment of signature is unstated in the minutes, and yet forms an image that will travel. Pens produce short strokes and dates. Folders accept the papers. Aides collect the sheets and secure them. There is no applause, only chairs drawn back and a general intake of breath that follows any long task when it reduces itself to final pages. Outside, the city carries on with its summer routines under hardship. Queues at bakeries, bicycles leaning against fences, trams that ring their bells and move again. The communiqué will meet that city in printed form and on radio schedules. It will sound calm and measured because calm and measured is the only tone that can fit these facts. The delegates review a last technical item, the exchange of liaison officers between directorates to smooth disputes before they harden and then allow the hour to close. The scene does not end with verdicts. It ends with a program of work and a public sentence designed to travel further than the meeting ever will. The bridge to the closing lies not in the grandeur of conclusion, but in the quiet act of dispersal. When the steps in the corridor resume and the documents begin their life outside this room, moving toward offices that must now turn phrasing into practice. The last hours at Cecilienhof feel less like a curtain and more like a well-ordered pause. The courtyard holds its late light, the brick and stone radiating the day's stored warmth into the evening air. Inside, folders are tied with ribbon, initials sit where they should, and copies begin their slow route toward Berlin offices that will stamp, index, and dispatch. The official communiqué, compact and restrained, is ready to be read aloud. Its sentences offer a path that is at once clear and conditional. Germany to be administered as one economic unit, authority to be exercised through joint structures, removals and prosecutions to proceed within agreed frames, population movements to be managed under supervision. The tone is plain by design. It allows many audiences to hear the same message and accept it for their different reasons. A cautious mind might notice how often the language admits revision, how the verbs sit a step short of finality. That caution is not a flaw. It is a recognition that paper can guide but not compel. Beyond the palace, a city waits for bread, fuel, and steady instruction. The minutes and directives will matter there, more than photographs of men in dark suits. In the conference rooms, ashtrays are emptied and water glasses drained. The bell that was never rung remains on the table, a symbol of procedure that did not need to announce itself. Staff cars nose forward, engines ticking, headlamps masked by habit. What has been achieved is a framework that may hold if worked with discipline, patience, and luck. What remains uncertain is whether differing aims will bend without breaking the forms agreed here. As the motorcades turn toward Berlin and the first orders are translated for distribution, another task waits in the wings: meetings of foreign ministers, further protocols, and the daily tests of enforcement in streets that must now learn the meaning of shared authority. In a city marked by ruin and routine, how far can carefully chosen words carry the weight placed upon them? And what shape will the next decisions take when maps and timetables meet the limits of winter and will?